How far would you go to protect what you love without losing who you are? Amelia Carter was used to facing challenges at work. As a business journalist in New York, she knew that the financial market was a field where every story required precision and speed. However, her next goal was tougher than any investigation she had done before: securing an interview with Oliver Hayes, CEO of Hayes Capital, one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. The man was known for his rigorous control over his public image, rarely granting interviews and remaining untouchable within his circle of power. Amelia took a deep breath as she adjusted her hair in front of the mirror in the lobby of a five-star hotel. She was at an exclusive investors event, a unique chance for selected journalists to observe the top minds in the financial sector. Dressed in an elegant navy blue suit, she tried to blend in with the economic elite, though her eyes remained focused on the lookout for Oliver. For her, an interview with him was the missing piece to propel her career forward and perhaps prove to herself that she was on the right path. After 20 minutes of searching, Amelia spotted him in a corner of the room, talking to a small group of executives. Oliver Hayes was imposing, a presence that commanded the space effortlessly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a serious, chiseled face, he seemed oblivious to the buzz around him. His dark suit and reserved gestures conveyed a calculated confidence, the type of self-control that few people can cultivate. He was known for this almost cold calm that left everyone around him uncertain of his true intentions. Watching him, Amelia felt a strange mix of fascination and unease. When Oliver finally stepped away from the group and headed to the bar to grab a glass of wine, Amelia saw her chance. She adjusted her posture, took a deep breath, and walked toward him. When she was close enough for him to notice her presence, she offered a slight smile, trying to appear calm even though she wasn't. "Mr. Hayes," she began, extending her hand. "My name is Amelia Carter. I'm a journalist with Business Insight. Could I have a few minutes of your time?" He looked at her hand for a moment, as if calculating whether the contact was worth it, before shaking it briefly. His dark eyes were unreadable, though Amelia sensed a slight trace of exasperation on his face. "I appreciate your initiative, Miss Carter, but I don't give interviews without prior scheduling," he replied, his voice low and steady. "If you need information, contact my press office." "I tried," Amelia countered, keeping her gaze steady, "for over 2 months, actually, and I received no response. I thought this event might be a good opportunity to address the points of interest regarding Hayes Capital directly." Oliver tilted his head slightly, studying her with a calculated look. She noticed that he was evaluating her, perhaps deciding if this was a confrontation he wanted to prolong. "And what exactly do you think you know about Hayes Capital, Miss Carter?" "Enough to know that you've been championing investments in social causes, which is unusual for someone with your profile. I want to understand why you're taking this direction and the impact it could have on your business model." He raised an eyebrow, surprised. Amelia detected a spark of interest, though he kept a neutral expression. Oliver took a sip of wine before responding. "And if I told you there's nothing altruistic in my decisions, that I'm not interested in social causes beyond their profitability, I wouldn't believe you," Amelia replied promptly, crossing her arms. "Hayes Capital would never invest so heavily in sustainability without some genuine commitment. And I want to understand that side of you, Mr. Hayes. I want to know what drives your decisions beyond profit." For a brief second, she thought she saw a hint of admiration in Oliver's eyes, but he quickly looked away, unreadable once again. Amelia knew she was treading dangerous territory. Any slip, and he could shut down completely. "You're very persistent," he remarked with a half smile, though he didn't seem genuinely amused. "But what makes you think I can trust you to write honestly about my company?" "My integrity, Mr. Hayes," Amelia replied without hesitation. "I don't exaggerate stories, nor do I seek scandals where there aren't any. My interest is to show the public the human side behind financial decisions. If you give me the opportunity, I guarantee Hayes Capital will have a unique story in the pages of Business Insight." He remained silent, assessing her once again. Amelia felt her heart race. She sensed she was on the edge of a precipice, waiting for him to make a decision. "All right," he finally said, his voice firm. "But only if you're willing to be part of the process up close. I'm in need of a communication consultant for a social investment project. You'll accompany me over the coming weeks. And if you're still interested in understanding the reasons behind my decisions, we can talk." Amelia was surprised by the proposal. It wasn't the kind of work she expected, and it certainly wasn't common for a journalist, but the opportunity was one of a kind. She felt a surge of excitement at the thought of direct access to Hayes Capital's operations and to Oliver himself. He was testing her interest, and she was determined not to show hesitation. "I accept the offer," she said with renewed confidence. "When do we start?" Oliver gave a faint smile that seemed more like a hint of a challenge. "Tomorrow, in my office. Don't be late." He walked away without saying anything else, leaving Amelia with a mixture of emotions ranging from excitement to anxiety. It was hard to believe that, in just a few minutes, she had achieved more than she'd hoped. However, the way Oliver scrutinized her, as if he were constantly measuring her value and sincerity, made her realize this wouldn't be easy. He was more than just a CEO. He was a strategist who played with every word and gesture. A man who, with a single look, seemed to see through people. When she got home that night, Amelia couldn't sleep. Oliver's face and the intensity of his gaze still echoed in her mind. She replayed every moment of the conversation, trying to understand the nuances, the subtext. In part, she felt triumphant, but she couldn't ignore the unease that consumed her. She had accepted an unprecedented challenge, and for the first time, she wasn't sure exactly what she was getting into. The next morning, she woke up early, prepared her materials, and headed to the address of Hayes Capital, in an imposing building in downtown Manhattan. Upon entering Oliver's office, she was greeted coldly by the receptionist, but was soon directed to an elegant meeting room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. When Oliver entered, his presence filled the room. He greeted her briefly and began explaining the social project he was involved in. The methodical and controlled way he laid out each detail was impressive. He seemed to have complete command of every aspect of his company and the impact he sought to achieve. However, the conversation soon took on a more personal tone. "Tell me, Miss Carter, why did you choose financial journalism?" he asked, observing her with the same evaluative look as the night before. Amelia hesitated. She knew this was yet another way for him to test her, but she decided to be honest. "I've always been fascinated by the power money and finance have to shape the world," she replied. "I want to show people the impact of these decisions so they understand that the financial world isn't just about numbers, but about people and real consequences." Oliver nodded but seemed to want more. He continued asking incisive questions, as if he wanted to gauge her motivations and explore any vulnerabilities she might have. Each of Amelia's responses was scrutinized by him with a look that left no room for weaknesses. After an hour of discussion, he stood up. "I think that's all for today," he declared, still not showing whether he was satisfied or not. "We'll meet tomorrow with the team. I hope you're ready." Amelia left the building with the sense that she had undergone some kind of test and that maybe she had managed to prove something to him. However, she also felt that the barrier between them was far from being broken. Oliver was a man of mysteries, and she couldn't resist the attraction she felt in trying to uncover them. What had started as just a career goal was now beginning to blend with personal curiosity. She knew that from that day forward, her life was about to change. Amelia still felt the impact of her encounter with Oliver from the previous night. He had challenged her, tested her, and somehow seemed to have liked what he saw. But that morning, as she hastily drank her coffee, she was still processing his unexpected invitation. Oliver wanted her to work directly for him, and the project at hand went far beyond what any journalist would typically do. When she arrived at the Hayes Capital building, a modern skyscraper with glass walls and security guards at every entrance, Amelia realized she was about to dive into a completely new dimension of her work. She was a journalist but was now crossing a line and stepping into the very structure of one of the nation's largest investment firms, alongside one of the most reserved and powerful businessmen in the city. As she passed through the lobby, an assistant escorted her to the top floor, where the executive offices were located. As soon as the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by an impeccable setting, with leather furniture, strategically placed plants, and a visibly spotless workspace. The glass windows offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan. But Amelia barely had time to take in the scenery before Oliver himself greeted her. He awaited her at his office door, dressed in a dark suit perfectly aligned. His expression was neutral, but his eyes studied her intently. "Miss Carter," he greeted, motioning for her to enter. "I hope you're ready to gain a better understanding of how Hayes Capital operates." "I'm prepared," Amelia replied, keeping steady despite the tension she still felt in his presence. Oliver gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. She took a seat, maintaining a steady gaze and confident posture. He settled across the desk, his fingers intertwined as he watched her, a faint shadow of curiosity on his face. "I want to be clear about what I expect from this project," he began, his voice deep and controlled. "I'm not just offering a series of interviews. My proposal is for you to observe and participate closely, to grasp the essence of our projects and portray them accurately." "I understand," Amelia replied, noting how Oliver seemed to weigh each word. "But does that mean I'll be acting as a temporary consultant? Is that what you're saying?" Oliver nodded slowly, as if he were considering the implications of his own proposal. "Yes, for a few weeks. You'll have a place here, observing operations, and more importantly, you'll have access to the project we're developing. It's a sustainable investment initiative aimed at benefiting startups with positive social impact. I want you to deliver a faithful and complete account of what you witness." Amelia absorbed Oliver's words with a mixture of excitement and caution. This was more than she had expected, far more than any reporter could dream of achieving. Oliver's proposal was risky for both of them. He would be exposing his company to a journalist, providing an opportunity that could enhance his corporation's image or, depending on what Amelia discovered, bring unpredictable consequences. "I want you to understand," he continued with a piercing look, "that this is a chance to showcase the ethical and social side of Hayes Capital. I expect you to be honest but also objective. You can trust my integrity, Mr. Hayes," she replied resolutely. "I'm a journalist, not interested in distorting the facts. If what you're telling me is true, I'm certain it will be an impressive story." Oliver nodded, satisfied with her response, then picked up a file from his desk and handed it to Amelia. "This is a project summary. Tomorrow we start with an introductory meeting. You'll meet the core team and interact with each member, but be aware that any confidential information must stay within the company until the final publication." She took the file and nodded, trying to ignore the tingling excitement in her chest. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, and now that she had the information in her hands, she needed to make every minute count. Still, she couldn't help but wonder about Oliver's motivations. "Why are you giving me this opportunity, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes. Oliver seemed to consider her question before responding. He relaxed slightly in his chair, though his gaze remained sharp. "Because I want people to understand that business and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. But to achieve that, I need a truthful narrative from someone unafraid of the impact the truth may bring." Amelia felt a mix of admiration and skepticism. It was hard to imagine that someone like Oliver, so enveloped in power and control, genuinely had a commitment to social ethics. Even so, the challenge was on, and she was willing to accept it. "Excellent," she said, flashing a faint smile. "I'll work hard to honor that trust." Oliver held her gaze, and Amelia felt as if he were searching for something more in her expression, a kind of confirmation of her sincerity. "Then we're in agreement," he said, ending the conversation. "Tomorrow we begin, Miss Carter. Be prepared." Amelia left the office with the file firmly in her hands, her heart racing as she processed everything that had happened in that brief meeting. She knew Oliver was testing her limits, but she was determined to prove her capability. She knew that working with him would bring emotional and professional challenges few could handle, but she was ready to face them. The following day, Amelia arrived at Hayes Capital's building punctually, impeccably dressed and with the file ready in her bag. As she passed through reception, she felt a mix of nerves and excitement, aware that she was about to dive into a new world. She was led to a modern, sophisticated conference room, where she found Oliver and a team of executives. Oliver introduced her to the team briefly, presenting each member of the project. There were financial analysts, sustainability consultants, and communications specialists, all seeming slightly distrustful of a journalist's presence. Each face she met represented another link in a complex chain that she would need to unravel and understand to eventually create an authentic and powerful narrative about Oliver's project. Oliver spent the meeting laying out the details of the project. It was an ambitious initiative aimed at identifying and funding startups committed to sustainability and social responsibility. The plan was to create a support network for these companies, providing financial resources, consultancy, and strategic partnerships. However, there was immense pressure for every decision made to be successful, as any misstep could damage Hayes Capital's image. Amelia took notes on every detail, fascinated by the project's complexity and potential impact. When the meeting concluded, Oliver asked her to accompany him to his office. "What did you think?" he asked, looking at her with curiosity. "It's an ambitious project," she replied honestly, "and I'm glad to witness it up close." "Then make the most of the opportunity, Miss Carter," he said in a tone that seemed both encouraging and cautionary. "But remember, I'm not interested in empty words. If you find flaws, point them out. If something feels wrong, tell me directly." Those words resonated with Amelia. Oliver wasn't just allowing her to observe. He demanded an honesty she hadn't anticipated. She realized he was playing a dangerous game, but she also saw it as a chance to finally understand who he really was. Over the following days, Amelia began to accompany the team in meetings, speaking with project members and gathering detailed information. She observed Oliver whenever she could, noting that his presence was almost magnetic, a blend of intelligence and determination that both intimidated and captivated. One afternoon, during a meeting, Oliver watched her attentively as she took notes. He seemed interested in how she absorbed the information, as if he were trying to decipher her thoughts. When the meeting ended, he called her over for a private conversation. "I believe you've noticed the tensions within the team," he said as they settled into a smaller meeting room. "Not everyone is comfortable with your presence. Many don't trust journalists." Amelia nodded, understanding the challenge. "I know it's unusual to have a journalist around, but I'm here to observe and understand, not to harm anyone's work." Oliver studied her for a long moment before responding. "I hope you'll keep that promise, Miss Carter, and know that I'm watching every move." That conversation marked a crucial point in their relationship. Oliver was testing Amelia, probing to see how far she was willing to go. He was a man of few words, but each of his statements seemed laden with hidden meanings. Each day, Amelia became more absorbed by Oliver's presence and the complexity of the project. She was captivated by the depth of the company's operations and by Oliver's strategic vision. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the growing tension between them, a tension she couldn't quite describe, but that made her question her own limits. The daily interaction fostered a silent, intense connection between Oliver and Amelia, even amidst tense discussions and challenging looks. Amelia knew she was treading dangerous ground, but she also knew she was completely drawn to this complex, enigmatic man, which made her waver between admiration and the fear of what might come next. Since accepting the temporary consulting role at Hayes Capital, Amelia had been working hard to understand Oliver's role in the ambitious project. She was surprised to discover just how personally he involved himself, going beyond the typical CEO role and showing genuine interest in the social impact of the company's investments. Unlike many executives she had interviewed, who saw sustainability only as a draw for investors, Oliver seemed to truly believe that his work could bring about significant change. One particularly busy morning, Amelia was in the main conference room, where the presentation for the next phase of the project would take place. The team was tense, knowing that Oliver was extremely particular about every detail. The anxious looks exchanged by team members around the table underscored the pressure hanging in the air. Amelia was preparing to take notes when she heard Oliver's footsteps entering the room. He greeted everyone with a slight nod and settled at the head of the table, radiating an effortless authority that commanded respect. The meeting began with an analyst presenting the results of a survey on potential beneficiaries of the social investment. Amelia was focused, absorbing each detail, until she sensed a shift in the room's atmosphere. "We've identified some companies that meet our sustainability criteria," the analyst said. "However, some of them have unstable financial projections, which could jeopardize Hayes Capital's image. Amelia noticed that some team members cast wary glances her way, their expressions guarded. They seemed to question the reliability of a journalist in such a strategic meeting. Then one of the senior directors, a man named Thompson known for his strict demeanor, interrupted. "I'm not sure it's appropriate to discuss these details in the presence of a journalist," Thompson said, casting an incisive look in Amelia's direction. "After all, we wouldn't want sensitive information to be misinterpreted, would we?" Amelia felt her face flush. She had dealt with hostile situations before, but this one felt different. She was aware of the uncomfortable position she occupied at Hayes Capital, where many saw her as an outsider. But before she could respond, Oliver intervened. "Thompson," his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Miss Carter is here at my invitation and is as committed to the integrity of this project as any of us. I trust her judgment to understand what is appropriate to disclose." The silence that followed was thick. Amelia's eyes met Oliver's briefly, and she saw a glint of determination, something protective, as if he were not only defending her place on the team, but also her professional integrity. Thompson, seemingly taken aback, nodded, turning back to his documents, visibly uncomfortable. Amelia kept her expression composed, but inside, she felt a whirlwind of emotions. Oliver's intervention had shaken her in an unexpected way. There was something in the way he took responsibility for her that not only surprised her, but also left her feeling vulnerable. She felt strangely grateful, and his presence, more intense at that moment, left her unsettled. The meeting continued, and Amelia tried to focus on the discussions, but her thoughts kept returning to the moment when Oliver had stood up for her. Why had he done that? He could have chosen a neutral response, something that sidestepped the issue without exposing himself. But he had chosen to take a firm stance, making it clear to everyone that she was welcome and that her presence there had his trust. When the meeting finally ended, Oliver approached Amelia as the others dispersed. "Miss Carter, a moment." She nodded, staying by the table as the others left, exchanging curious glances. Once they were alone, he looked at her with a serious expression, but with a softness she hadn't seen before. "Don't let people like Thompson intimidate you," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but firm. "You're here because I believe you can make a difference in how the project will be understood by the public." "Thank you for your confidence, Mr. Amelia replied, striving to maintain a formal tone. "But I really didn't expect. Well, I didn't expect you to defend me like that." Oliver studied her for a moment, his intense gaze taking in her face, perhaps noticing the slight embarrassment she was trying to hide. He gave a faint smile, though there was evident caution in his expression. "I only defend those who deserve it, Miss Carter," he replied, with a look that seemed to see beyond her surface, sensing something more than her words conveyed. "And you've shown from day one that you take your work seriously." Amelia felt a surprising warmth at his words. Her throat tightened, and she realized she couldn't find an adequate response. Oliver's words sounded more intense than he likely intended, and the closeness between them was beginning to evolve into something difficult to define. She felt the air grow denser, as if something unsaid hovered between them. "I'll keep doing my best to meet your expectations, Mar. Hayes," she finally managed to say, her voice slightly unsteady. He held her gaze for another moment, and Amelia noticed that the controlled mask he always wore seemed slightly altered, as if he were on the verge of saying something more. But instead, he looked away, returning to his trademark cold and calculated demeanor. "Good, I hope you continue to do so," he said, abruptly ending the subject and turning back to his desk. "See you tomorrow." Amelia nodded and left his office with her heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Throughout her journey home, she replayed every detail of that conversation, each expression and word exchanged. It was as if, within minutes, something had shifted between them, something subtle but undeniable. In the days that followed, Amelia continued her work with the Hayes Capital team. But the dynamic between her and Oliver seemed to have entered new, more complex territory. He remained reserved and distant most of the time, but there were moments when she caught his gaze on her, as if he were trying to decipher what was going through her mind. Amelia knew she was treading on dangerous ground. She was there to work, to observe, but her closeness to Oliver was affecting her in ways she couldn't control. His impact on her life, though silent, was becoming increasingly intense. With each interaction, she sensed the attraction growing, the mutual attraction that both seemed reluctant to admit. One afternoon, while she was reviewing market analysis data in the conference room, Oliver entered unexpectedly and approached her. His steps were firm, and his presence immediately dominated the space. Amelia felt her heart race again, but tried to stay calm, focusing on the documents in front of her. "How is the article coming along?" he asked, his voice controlled. "It's progressing," she replied in a neutral tone. "I'm trying to capture the social impact of the project authentically. I know it's important." Oliver nodded, and for a moment, silence hung between them. Amelia felt his gaze on her, as if he were assessing every word she said. "You've done a good job, Miss Carter," he said after a moment. "I don't say this lightly, but I must admit you've exceeded my expectations." The compliment took her by surprise. Amelia looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The intensity in Oliver's gaze made her feel as though he was probing her thoughts, discovering every emotion she tried to suppress. She realized that this moment was more than just a compliment. It was a confirmation that both were increasingly aware of the tension between them. But, as if waking from a trance, Oliver quickly assumed a neutral expression and looked away. He stepped back with a swift movement, signaling that the conversation was over, leaving Amelia with a sense of emptiness and a mix of frustration and confusion. In the hours that followed, Amelia struggled to focus on her work, but the image of Oliver, the intensity of his gaze, and the firmness of his words kept echoing in her mind. She felt torn, part of her wanting to keep the relationship strictly professional, and the other, more impulsive side, yearning to break down the barriers and discover what truly lay behind Oliver's facade. Later that same week, at a business dinner with the team, Amelia and Oliver found themselves in a more informal setting. While chatting with other executives, she noticed their glances crossing in quick, fleeting but intense moments. Oliver maintained his distant demeanor, but there was a shadow of emotion on his face each time he looked at her. A shadow he seemed to work hard to contain. When the dinner ended, Amelia was about to leave when she felt a presence beside her. It was Oliver again, this time with a gentle, almost vulnerable expression. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice nearly a whisper. Amelia looked at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. There was something different, something that made it clear that, despite all the barriers, he was not immune to the tension between them. She wanted to respond, wanted to say something to show she understood, but the words eluded her. Instead, they stood there in silence, letting the weight of everything they couldn't say speak for itself. The sound of notifications on Amelia's phone was the first sign that something was wrong. It was a cold morning, and she was in Hayes Capital's office, reviewing notes on the sustainability project, when she noticed her phone lighting up repeatedly. Messages from colleagues, her magazine editor, and even friends in the finance industry filled the screen. She swiped to open her notifications and was immediately confronted by a headline from a major news outlet. "Scandal at Hayes Capital. CEO Oliver Hayes accused of fund mismanagement in sustainability project." Amelia felt a sudden chill. The headline hit her like a knife, and her mind raced to make sense of what she was reading. She began skimming the article. The text alleged that Oliver had been diverting funds from the project to other areas of the company, violating transparency guidelines and compromising the startups involved. It was a harsh piece, one that didn't hesitate to accuse and tarnish Hayes Capital's image, suggesting that the sustainable initiative was merely a front for unethical financial operations. Sitting there, Amelia felt a surge of indignation and doubt. She couldn't believe something like this was happening, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that she was being kept in the dark. As a seasoned journalist, she knew when a situation felt glossed over. "How did I miss this?" she thought, her chest tightening. If it was true that Oliver was using the project as a front, this wouldn't just damage her career, but also destroy everything Hayes Capital had worked toward. Amelia realized she needed answers, and she needed them immediately. Getting up, she walked firmly through the office, ignoring the curious glances from employees around her. She headed straight to the floor where Oliver's office was located. Upon reaching his secretary, Amelia informed her, with a determined look, that she needed to speak with him immediately. Oliver was seated in his leather chair, his face tense. When he saw Amelia enter unannounced, he raised his eyes, a mix of irritation and surprise flashing in them. "Amelia?" His voice was steady, but there was a stiffness in his tone that she hadn't encountered before. She stepped closer, unwavering. "Oliver, I need to understand what's going on," she began, without preamble. "This news, is it true?" Oliver looked at her for a moment, his gaze cold and calculating. He took a deep breath, and Amelia noticed a slight tremor in his hand, a sign that the situation might have shaken him more than he cared to admit. "It's not what it seems, Amelia," he replied, every word laden with restrained tension. "This article is a distortion of the facts. Fun manipulation? That's absurd. Then why would anyone say that?" she countered, unable to hide her indignation. "If there's nothing wrong, how did this information leak?" "Oliver, this isn't something I can ignore." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as if he was fighting an internal battle. In a fleeting instant, she saw vulnerability in his face, as if his armor had been stripped away. Then, he turned away, walking over to the window, his back to her. "This isn't the first time the media has turned against me, Amelia," he said, his voice now a bitter whisper. "This article is just another attempt to destroy everything I've built. They did the same to my father." Amelia watched him closely, catching the pained tone in his words. Oliver rarely mentioned his family, and this reference to his father revealed a side of him she didn't know. Determined to understand more, she took a step forward. "What happened to him?" Oliver remained silent for a moment, his shoulders tense as he continued looking outside. Finally, he turned to face her, his eyes dark and fixed. "My father was the CEO of one of the biggest tech corporations in the country," he began, his tone heavy. "But there was a scandal, a media attack that destroyed him. The pressure led him to make poor decisions. He lost everything in the end. I grew up watching how cruel this world can be, how any mistake, true or false, is turned into a weapon against you." He paused, and Amelia could see the pain he tried to keep hidden. The scandal surrounding his father had left deep scars, a weight he carried with him to this day. "When I inherited Hayes Capital, I swore I'd never make the same mistakes, that I'd protect myself from every angle, and that's exactly why this project is so important. It's not a front, Amelia. I'm trying to prove that it's possible to do something genuine." She observed Oliver's expression, sensing an almost anguished sincerity in his words. But as a journalist, she knew she couldn't just accept his words without questioning. There was a fine line between what he was saying and what she needed to understand for her own commitment to the truth. "I want to believe you, Oliver," she said softly, "but I need to understand what's really happening. These accusations are serious. If you want my help, you need to be transparent with me." He nodded, though his face still reflected an internal struggle. "All right," he murmured. "I'll tell you." Oliver explained that some of the contracts and financial reports for the project were indeed under review. There was an outside firm involved, and they were conducting an internal audit to clarify any discrepancies. Oliver's team had been meticulous in selecting the startups, but he believed someone might have taken advantage of the process to exploit resources. Despite his precautions, he now feared that his team might have made a grave error. "I'm not saying I'm entirely free of responsibility," Oliver continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I trusted people I thought were committed to the project, and now I'm faced with this." "So you suspect someone on your own team?" Amelia asked, processing the information. Oliver nodded, his face hardening. "Yes, but I'm still investigating. I can't just accuse anyone without concrete evidence." Amelia took in everything he'd said. It wasn't easy for her to see the typically cold and controlled man showing such vulnerability. The image of Oliver in an internal struggle between what he felt and what he showed the world affected her in ways she couldn't define. "I'll write the story fairly, Oliver. I won't publish anything until we have all the facts," she promised, keeping her gaze steady. "But I need you to be honest with me about every detail. If you want my help, you have to trust me." Oliver looked at her, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt lighter, though there was still a noticeable tension. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. "It's not easy for me to trust, Amelia," he murmured, his voice rough. "Every time I've tried, I've been betrayed. You know how brutal the corporate world can be." Amelia nodded slowly. She knew she was getting involved in a situation that transcended the boundaries of journalistic objectivity. Something between them was changing, and she realized that, despite trying to keep her distance, her heart was already involved. Oliver was not just a powerful, cold CEO. He was a man carrying the weight of his wounds. And somehow, she wanted to help him overcome them. "Then let's face this together," she said with a small smile. "We'll get to the bottom of this scandal. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver took a deep breath, and for an instant, she saw a glimmer of relief in his face. It was as if he had found in Amelia someone who saw beyond the businessman. Someone who saw the vulnerable man behind his public image. And at that moment, a new connection formed between them. One that went beyond work, a bond they both knew would be tested. As she left Oliver's office that night, Amelia felt a whirlwind of emotions that left her breathless. She felt torn between her journalistic duty and the growing feelings she had for this complex, enigmatic man. And she knew that, from then on, the road ahead would only get harder. Oliver was someone who avoided trusting others at all costs. But that day, he had let his guard down, if only for a moment, allowing her to see the weight of his scars. Amelia promised herself that she would help him face this crisis, not just as a journalist, but as an ally. The night stretched on, and the city lights gleamed through the wide windows of Oliver's office, casting a nearly poetic contrast against the dimly lit room. Amelia was reviewing the internal audit documents for the third time, hoping to find a logical thread among the data that might clear Oliver's name from the accusations. A deep silence filled the room, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional sigh of fatigue. Oliver sat beside her, meticulously analyzing the detailed report of one of the startups involved in the project. He looked exhausted, but his posture remained upright, and his attention never wavered. They had been there for hours, working tirelessly to find any evidence that might serve as a defense for the scandal threatening the company and his reputation. Yet, as time passed and the silence deepened, Amelia felt the weight of something more: attention that accumulated with every glance, with every quiet moment of proximity. Somewhere during that night, she realized that the boundaries between them were growing dangerously thin. This was not the Oliver she had first met. He was no longer merely the reserved and meticulous CEO. Before her was a man who, in the end, wrestled with his own fears and limitations. Seeing him this way, vulnerable yet resolute, something within her softened. This constant closeness was turning into something she knew was dangerous, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "Amelia, look at this," Oliver said, breaking the silence as he pointed to a line in one of the reports. His voice was rough, but it held the usual firmness. "This error here, do you see it? I think this is where everything started." Amelia leaned in to study the document more closely, realizing just how close he was. She caught the subtle scent of his cologne, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee that filled the room. Her breathing slowed, every cell in her body hyper-aware of Oliver's presence mere inches away. She nodded, trying to focus on what he was saying, but the words seemed to blur as her senses mingled with the nearness between them. Oliver appeared to notice as well, because he hesitated, pulling back slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, as if he too felt the tension that Amelia was trying to ignore. "Yes, it's just, I think the exhaustion is getting to me," she murmured, avoiding his gaze as she returned to the report. But before she could redirect her attention to the paper, she felt Oliver's hand touch her arm. It was a light gesture, but it carried a world of meaning. She looked up and found his eyes on hers, filled with a restrained intensity, as if he were fighting something within himself. For a moment, it felt like they were suspended in their own world, where logic and duty no longer held sway. "Amelia," he began, but his voice faltered, as if he were uncertain of his own words. His hand lingered on her arm, and Amelia didn't pull away. The air between them felt thicker. Each breath shared a mutual effort. Oliver leaned in slowly, his gaze moving from her eyes to her lips, as if seeking silent permission. Amelia felt her heart pounding, unable to look away, unable to step back. The attraction between them was something that had grown silently, nurtured by every interaction, every moment of shared understanding. Now it was there, undeniable, inescapable. Before either could rationalize their actions, their lips met in a kiss that was gentle, yet brimming with the tension they had both been holding back. The touch was both tender and urgent, as though they knew they were crossing a line they couldn't undo. Amelia felt a shiver run through her body, her hands instinctively reaching to touch Oliver's face, as if she feared this moment could slip away at any second. The kiss deepened, and the world around them disappeared, leaving only the warmth and closeness of two hearts beating in sync. For a brief moment, everything made sense. The fear, the distrust, the caution, it all melted away, replaced by something they barely dared to acknowledge. But as quickly as it had begun, the moment ended. Oliver pulled back, his breathing uneven, his gaze fixed on the floor as he processed what had just happened. Amelia remained still, her heart racing and the weight of reality descending upon them. I shouldn't have done that," he murmured, running a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. "This isn't right. I can't allow this." Amelia felt a wave of disappointment and anger. Although she knew the risks of becoming involved, something inside her pushed back against the cold rationality that Oliver was trying to impose. "Oliver," she began, struggling to find the right words. "We can't pretend this didn't happen. We can't just ignore it." Oliver lifted his gaze to her, and there was something pained in his expression. It was as if he was battling his own feelings, torn between desire and responsibility. "Amelia, you know this could ruin everything. My reputation, the project, even your career." He paused, taking a deep breath. "There are people waiting for me to make a mistake. People who would use any error against me, and I can't allow you to become a target in this war." Amelia felt his words like a blow, but at the same time, she understood the depth of his concerns. He was trying to protect her, but there was also his fear of exposing himself, of becoming vulnerable in a way he couldn't control. "I understand the risks, Oliver, but I also know that we can't live in constant fear of what others might think," she replied, holding his gaze steady. He remained silent, the tension between them palpable. For a brief moment, she thought he might give in, might allow this moment to turn into something more. But instead, Oliver closed his eyes and took a deep breath, regaining his composure. "I can't," he said, his tone final. "I can't let this jeopardize everything I've worked for. I hope you understand." Amelia nodded slowly, unable to hide the disappointment on her face. She knew that, for him, this was more than a matter of choice. It was a struggle against his own fears and limitations. Still, the rejection hit her deeply. She felt exposed, as if she had surrendered to a moment only to be pushed back into the cold, calculated world he inhabited. That night, Amelia left the office feeling torn. On one hand, she understood Oliver's reasons. He was under immense pressure, and to him, a relationship with her might mean more complications than rewards. But on the other hand, her heart couldn't ignore what she had felt in that brief moment when their lips had met. It was something profound, real, and now that she had experienced that glimpse of emotion, she wasn't sure she could return to the state where they both kept safe, professional distances. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them changed subtly but noticeably. Oliver avoided any prolonged contact with her, keeping their conversations strictly professional and limited to essentials. It was as if he had erected an even stronger barrier, trying to neutralize any trace of what had happened. Amelia, for her part, felt the weight of that growing distance, a void she didn't know how to fill. She threw herself into her work, focusing on her research and analysis for the project, but inevitably, her thoughts drifted back to Oliver. Their interactions were laden with unspoken tension, every glance a reminder of what had happened and what might have been. The emotional strain was nearly unbearable, but neither seemed willing to talk about what had transpired. One afternoon, while reviewing a report in the conference room, Oliver entered unexpectedly. He maintained a neutral expression, but Amelia could see a shadow of something else on his face, something he was trying to conceal. He gave instructions quickly, avoiding prolonging the conversation, but before leaving, he hesitated briefly, as if wanting to say something. Amelia noticed, her heart quickening in anticipation that he might finally break down the barrier he had imposed. But instead, Oliver merely nodded, murmuring something in a low tone. "It's better this way, Amelia," he said, almost as if speaking to himself before leaving the room. Those words, though vague, echoed in her mind. It was a confirmation that he was as affected as she was, yet the choice to distance himself was final. Amelia felt a mix of frustration and sadness. She knew that this man, who fascinated and challenged her, was fighting his own emotions, refusing to let something real blossom between them. From that day on, Amelia realized that the connection she felt with Oliver wouldn't disappear so easily. Even if he kept his barriers and avoided any involvement, the feeling remained alive within her, a silent but persistent desire. And though she didn't know where this path would lead, she knew her life was no longer the same since he had entered it. The weeks following the kiss between Oliver and Amelia were filled with tension that grew stronger each day. Both tried to focus on their work and on saving Hayes Capital's sustainable project. But the attraction between them lingered like a silent electric current. Although visibly affected, Oliver remained professional, avoiding any situation that might expose them further. Amelia, for her part, threw herself into work, trying to suppress feelings she knew were risky and complicated. But something changed at the office. Amelia began to notice curious glances and whispered comments that fell silent whenever she entered a room. An uncomfortable, oppressive energy seemed to orbit around her. What started as mere rumors quickly turned into intrigue, and Amelia found herself the target of suspicious looks and unspoken words. One morning, as she entered the conference room for another project review, Amelia felt the heavy atmosphere. Some colleagues who had once treated her courteously now avoided her gaze, whispering among themselves. It was then she heard the implications that had previously only been hinted at. "They say she only got this position because of her closeness to Mr. Hayes," one of the analysts muttered to a colleague, casting a sideways glance at Amelia. Her face flushed with indignation and surprise. The words struck her like a punch in the stomach, leaving her disoriented. It was an insinuation that attacked her integrity and professionalism, ignoring all the effort she had poured into the project. Worse still, it suggested that her relationship with Oliver had crossed professional boundaries for personal gain. Oliver entered the room shortly afterward, his expression unreadable, and the conversation ceased instantly. He scanned the room, noting the tense expressions and the embarrassment on Amelia's face. But instead of addressing the tension, he took his seat and began the meeting with his usual directness, ignoring the heavy atmosphere that hung in the air. For Amelia, the hours that followed were a true test of endurance. She felt the weight of the stares, the whispered words circling around her, driving her into a growing state of anxiety. At times she noticed Oliver glancing at her, perhaps sensing her discomfort, but he remained steadfast, offering neither support nor explanation. She didn't know whether this left her feeling more reassured or furious. After the meeting, Amelia went to the rooftop terrace, seeking a moment of peace to process everything that was happening. The cool morning air seemed to relieve the tightness in her chest, but the indignation remained. She didn't know how the rumors had started, but she knew they were dangerous. Many people would seize on any whisper to undermine Oliver's image and, by extension, her own. Lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps and turned to see Oliver approaching. His expression was neutral, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that she recognized immediately. "We need to talk," he said in a low, controlled tone. Amelia nodded, and they both stood in silence, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The cold wind surrounded them, but the silence between them was even colder, weighted with unspoken words and feelings neither dared admit. "I know the rumors have reached you," Oliver began, his voice tense, "and I know how much this must be bothering you." Amelia exhaled, trying to rein in her frustration. "Bothering me?" she echoed, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "They're implying that I'm only here because of some supposed relationship with you. All my work, my effort, reduced to..." She trailed off, unable to finish, choking on indignation. Oliver continued to watch her, his eyes dark and attentive. He seemed to struggle with something within himself, and for a moment, she thought he would say something to defend her, to put an end to the rumors. But instead, he looked away, taking a deep breath. "We need to be rational, Amelia," he said in a firm but almost painful tone. "This project is too important, and I can't allow these intrigues to affect us. The situation calls for some distance." She stared at him, surprised and incredulous. "Distance?" she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. "You're telling me we should pretend that nothing happened?" Oliver took a deep breath, his eyes reflecting a restrained sadness. "It's that or lose what's left of our credibility," he said heavily. "People are watching our every move, waiting for a slip. I can't let this interfere with the project, and you shouldn't either." Amelia felt her heart clench, but she knew he was right. The pressure they both faced was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and the consequences could be devastating. Still, the sense of loss was overwhelming, as if something essential was being torn away from her. "So that's it," she murmured, struggling to hold back tears. "We're just going to ignore everything?" Oliver didn't respond. His silence seemed to confirm the decision, and before she could say anything else, he took a step back, as if he were already retreating, not only physically but also emotionally. "It's not easy for me, Amelia," he murmured, his voice filled with bitterness, "but it's what we need to do." With those words, Oliver turned and left the terrace, leaving Amelia alone with the growing emptiness in her chest. She stayed there, trying to compose herself, but her heart pounded painfully, each beat a reminder of the decision he had made. In the days that followed, the pain of their separation became increasingly evident. Oliver avoided her deliberately, keeping interactions strictly professional and delegating any matters involving her to other team members. Amelia tried to concentrate on her work, but his absence affected her in a deep, unexpected way. She was no longer the same since meeting him, and now the silence between them felt even more unbearable than any other challenge she had faced. Yet, the office rumors didn't die down. On the contrary, the distance between her and Oliver seemed to fuel the speculation. Many saw their separation as confirmation of suspicions, as if he were trying to cover something up. The situation became increasingly stifling, and Amelia felt that, no matter how hard she tried, she was trapped in a cycle of distrust and isolation. Then, in a moment of impulse, she decided to go to Oliver's office after hours. She knew he often stayed late, going over reports, and she wanted to settle things once and for all. When she arrived, she knocked lightly on the door and entered, finding him seated at his desk, engrossed in documents. Oliver looked up as she entered, and his expression hardened. Amelia took a deep breath, determined. "We need to resolve this, Oliver," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I can't go on like this, ignoring what happened and dealing with these rumors alone. You know, it's affecting me." He sighed, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. "Do you think this isn't affecting me too?" he murmured, his tone low, almost vulnerable. "It's not easy, Amelia, but we're dealing with something bigger than the two of us." Amelia held his gaze, feeling tears threatening to surface. "So you're really willing to lose me? To push me away over an image?" Oliver stood up, moving closer to her but maintaining a controlled distance. "Amelia, it's not just about image. If this escalates, the entire company could be at risk, and I don't want you to become an even bigger target." She nodded slowly, understanding his reasons, but the pain of rejection felt like a knot in her chest. She knew he was trying to protect her, but the weight of that protection was almost unbearable. "Then it's decided," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll stay on the project, but once everything is resolved, I'll step away." Oliver only nodded, his expression restrained, though his gaze revealed the same pain she felt. Amelia left his office, knowing that this decision was tearing her apart inside. And in the days that followed, they maintained their carefully constructed distance, completing tasks with the dedication of those concealing an invisible wound. Yet Amelia couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness. Every distant look, every silence between them, was a constant reminder of what they had lost. The days following Oliver's distancing were a test of patience and resilience for Amelia. She tried to stay focused on her work, but the pain of being pushed away and the persistent office rumors made the environment increasingly unbearable. Oliver's cold demeanor and his avoidance of personal contact were a constant reminder that whatever had been budding between them, something that had never been. Given a real chance had been sacrificed for reasons she still didn't fully understand. But then, one day, something unexpected happened. Amelia was in the records room, organizing old project reports, when a particular document caught her attention. It was a file dated many years back, related to Hayes Corporation, Oliver's family's first company. Amelia knew that Oliver's father, Leonard Hayes, had been a powerful and respected businessman. But Oliver had always kept any mention of his father under a veil of secrecy. Curious, she opened the file. Inside were a series of documents, old interviews, and newspaper clippings that painted a very different picture than she had expected. Leonard's public image had been that of a visionary and generous leader. But these clippings and transcripts revealed a darker side to the story. There were details of a financial scandal involving Hayes Corporation. Rumors that Leonard had used unethical strategies to protect the company. When the case went public, the media attacked without mercy. The impact of the scandal on Leonard's reputation had been devastating, leading to a sharp drop in Hayes Corporation's stock and a crisis that nearly drove the company to bankruptcy. Leonard ultimately resigned, but the Hayes family had never fully recovered from the negative exposure. Reading through these documents, Amelia felt a strange mix of sadness and understanding. Suddenly, Oliver's reserved and at times paranoid behavior began to make sense. Realizing she needed to understand more, she did some further research and discovered that the scandal had also deeply affected Oliver's childhood. She learned that, at the time, the Hayes family had been forced to withdraw from their social circle, with many friends and associates abandoning them. Oliver, still a teenager, bore the weight of seeing his father publicly discredited and humiliated, a formative experience that had undoubtedly shaped his behavior over the years. That night, as she reviewed all the information, Amelia felt a whirlwind of emotions. What had once seemed an unjust distancing now began to make sense. Oliver had real reasons to distrust the world, to avoid any emotional exposure. The shadow of his family's scandal still haunted him, and perhaps his fear of betrayal by those closest to him was rooted in those painful memories. Finally, she decided she needed to talk to him. Though hesitant, she knew that understanding his past was the only way to bridge the invisible divide between them. The next day, she waited until after hours and went to Oliver's office. Her heart pounded with a mix of nervousness and resolve as she sought the answers she had longed for. Upon entering, she found Oliver at his desk, immersed in paperwork as always. He looked up when she entered, visibly surprised. "Amelia, we're already past working hours," he said in a tone that tried to be casual but betrayed a certain unease. "I know, Oliver, but we need to talk," she replied, closing the door behind her. Oliver remained silent, watching her with his usual cautious gaze. But there was something different in his demeanor that night. Amelia took a deep breath before speaking. "I came across some documents about your family's past, about what happened with your father and Hayes Corporation," she said, her voice soft but determined. Oliver visibly tensed. It was as if she had just touched an old wound, and his reaction was immediate. He looked away, his lips pressing into a hard line, and for a moment, Amelia thought he would refuse to discuss it. But she pressed on. "I needed to understand, Oliver. I needed to know why you act this way, why you feel the need to protect yourself at all costs." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Now I see that this has more to do with what happened to your father than with what we feel for each other." Oliver looked at her, and Amelia saw a rare vulnerability in his eyes. She had never seen him so exposed, so unguarded. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Amelia, you don't know what it was like to live through that. To watch my family be destroyed because of public accusations, without ever having a real chance to defend ourselves," he said, his voice low and rough. "My father was a good man, but one mistake, just one mistake, cost him everything he built, and I watched it all fall apart." He paused, his gaze distant, as if reliving the painful moments of his past. "I was only 15, he continued. "My family lost almost all of our friends. We were shut out of events, of gatherings. I watched my father be treated like a criminal by people who had known him forever. And the press, the same press that praised him, destroyed him in a matter of days." Amelia felt her heart clench as she listened. Oliver was sharing his most painful memories, allowing her to glimpse a side of him she had never imagined. What she had thought was mere paranoia was, in fact, a deep ingrained fear of being betrayed and humiliated publicly. "I understand," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But Oliver, you're not alone anymore. This fear, you don't have to carry it by yourself." He looked at her, and for a moment, something in his expression softened. But then he shook his head, as if still resisting letting anyone get that close. "I can't take that risk, Amelia. I can't let any weakness of mine be used against me again. The pressure here is constant, and any mistake could be fatal." Amelia took a step closer, approaching him slowly, determined to break through his resistance. She lightly touched his arm, sensing the tension he tried to conceal. "I'm here with you," she said, her voice firm, "and I'm not on the outside, waiting for you to make a mistake. I'm here to support you, to face this battle alongside you. You don't have to isolate yourself." Oliver watched her, his expression filled with doubt and inner conflict. She could see that he was torn between wanting to trust her and fearing to open himself again. It was as if part of him longed to let down his guard, while another, the part wounded and cautious, wouldn't allow it. "Amelia," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "you're one of the few people I care about, and maybe that's precisely why I need to keep my distance. I don't want you to suffer because of me, because of who I am." She shook her head, refusing to accept that response. "I won't let you push me away out of fear. You have your reasons to be cautious, but we all have traumas, fears, and none of us can overcome them alone." Oliver took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he reopened them, he seemed more vulnerable than ever, as if the armor he always wore had finally broken. He moved closer to her, still hesitant, and Amelia could see the internal battle he was waging. "I don't know how to let you in," he confessed, his voice barely audible. She smiled, reaching out to touch his face gently, feeling the warmth of his skin against her fingers. It was the first time he allowed such closeness without pulling back, without hiding. "Then start slowly," she whispered. "I'm here, Oliver. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, as if he had finally found something he could trust. For a moment, time seemed to stop and the world around them faded, leaving only the connection they had finally allowed to exist. "Thank you for not giving up," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as if each word lifted a weight from his heart. Amelia smiled, knowing that something had changed between them. Oliver wasn't just allowing her to see his scars, he was trusting her to help heal them. The distance between them vanished, and a newfound trust began to grow. The days following the revelation of Oliver's past brought Amelia a new clarity, but also a painful uncertainty. Since that conversation in his office, where he had finally exposed his pain and his fear of trusting, Oliver seemed to have closed himself off again. Even after they shared such deep emotional intimacy, he had returned to his reserved stance, keeping his distance. Amelia understood it was a slow process, that he needed time to overcome his own traumas, but his absence hurt more than she wanted to admit. But that Friday night, everything was about to change. Amelia was at home, a forgotten cup of tea on the table, her gaze lost among the city lights. She was absorbed in thoughts of Oliver and the new article she was trying to complete. But her heart kept returning to him, to what they had shared, and to what might have been if he had allowed his defenses to fall. When the sound of the intercom broke the silence, she jumped. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. "Amelia, it's Oliver." His voice echoed over the intercom, tense and restrained. She hesitated for a moment, surprised. For an instant, she thought she was imagining it, but the surprise quickly turned into a mix of hope and anxiety. She pressed the button to let him in, her heart racing. Minutes later, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Oliver standing there, with an expression that seemed a mixture of urgency and vulnerability. He wore the same impeccable suit as always, but he looked tired, as if carrying a heavy burden. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that almost made her look away. "Oliver, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady but unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. He took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment as if searching for the right words. Finally, he stepped forward, and Amelia felt the intensity of his presence. "I tried," he began, his voice low, almost hoarse. I tried to forget. I tried to move on, to keep my distance, but I simply can't. You're on my mind all the time, Amelia. I keep finding myself coming back to you, even when I shouldn't. Amelia's heart raced, but she remained silent, letting him continue. Oliver seemed to be battling with himself, as if there was still a part of him trying to protect himself, but it was finally losing the fight. I don't want to fight this anymore, he confessed. His eyes locked onto hers. I know I can't offer you what you deserve, and I know I'm a mess when it comes to trust. But I need you, Amelia. I can't keep pretending to be indifferent. Those words touched her deeply. It was what she had hoped to hear. But she also felt the weight of his vulnerability, as if each word cost him an inner battle. Amelia smiled, taking a step forward until she was close enough to feel his breath. Then stop pretending, Oliver, she whispered, placing her hand gently on his face. I tried to ignore what I feel too, but the truth is, you're a part of me now. I don't care about a label or any ideal of perfection. I just want to be with you, however that may look. The hesitation in Oliver's eyes began to fade, and he raised his hand to her face, his fingers trembling as he touched her skin. It was as if he was seeking confirmation that this moment was real, that he could finally allow himself to feel. Amelia, he murmured before leaning in slowly and kissing her, a touch that was both soft and charged with repressed intensity. This time, there was no rush, no urgency. The kiss was a silent confession, a tacit agreement between two souls who, despite their fears and barriers, could no longer deny the connection they shared. Amelia felt herself wrapped up in him, feeling the warmth and protection of his arms around her. It was as if, in that moment, the whole world disappeared, leaving only the space they occupied. After a long moment, they pulled back slightly, their faces still close as they exchanged a look full of unspoken feelings. Oliver sighed, a breath that seemed to release a tension he was finally allowing himself to let go. I don't know where this will lead us, he admitted with a slight smile, a rare expression of softness on his face. But for the first time, I'm willing to find out without worrying about what might happen. Amelia nodded, feeling a quiet happiness wash over her. And that's exactly what I want, Oliver. We don't need anything more right now, she replied, entwining her fingers with his. That night marked the beginning of something new between them. It wasn't a relationship defined by conventions or expectations. It was a bond between two people who had found each other in a moment of mutual vulnerability and were willing to face their own fragilities together. Amelia knew that being with Oliver meant facing emotional barriers, that he likely wouldn't open up completely all at once, but she was ready to move forward, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, they kept their relationship discreet. Oliver remained reserved, maintaining his controlled demeanor in public and being cautious in their interactions. But Amelia noticed small changes. He was more present, more attentive to her needs, and occasionally, he allowed her to see the more affectionate and protective side he hid from everyone else. One evening, after dinner at Amelia's apartment, Oliver seemed more relaxed than usual. They were talking about their childhood experiences, and he shared some stories from his youth, before the scandal that had shattered his family's reputation. It was a side of him she had never known, a young and hopeful version of Oliver, who had wanted to make a difference in the business world without losing his integrity. I always knew I wanted to work in investments, but I never imagined the weight of my family's name would be so heavy, he said, his voice full of restrained bitterness. The expectations, the pressure, all of it can be crushing, and at some point, you start to lose yourself. Amelia listened intently, feeling grateful that he was allowing himself to share this with her. She placed her hand over his, offering silent support. You don't have to carry this burden alone, she said softly. I know it's hard to trust, but I'll be here, Oliver, no matter what happens. He looked at her, his face softer than she had ever seen. There was a tenderness in his eyes, an expression that spoke more than words ever could. Thank you, Amelia. I don't know how I made it this far without you, he murmured before pulling her close in a tight embrace, as if she were the anchor he so desperately needed. As time went on, though they were happy together, Amelia began to notice that, at certain moments, Oliver still put up barriers. It was as if he avoided fully surrendering, always keeping a part of himself locked away in an inaccessible place. She understood his fears, but sometimes she wondered if he would ever be able to fully trust her. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Amelia decided to bring it up. They stopped to sit on a bench by the lake, and she held his hand, looking him in the eyes with seriousness. "Oliver, I want you to know you don't have to protect yourself from me," she began, hesitant but determined. "I know it's hard, but I need you to trust me, truly." Oliver watched her in silence, and Amelia could see the internal struggle reflected in his eyes. He took a deep breath, as if the words he wanted to say were difficult to articulate. "Amelia, I try every day, but the fear of losing control, of losing you, is stronger than anything I've ever felt." She squeezed his hand, understanding that this was the hardest obstacle for Oliver. "I know, and I'm here to face it with you," she replied with an encouraging smile. "I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, offering a small smile in response. But Amelia knew it would be a slow process. Oliver carried burdens she could hardly imagine, and total trust was a step he wasn't ready to take yet. Even so, she was determined to stand by him, to help him face each challenge, and to celebrate every small victory they achieved together. And that night, as they watched the city lights reflected on the lake, Amelia knew she was exactly where she needed to be by Oliver's side, ready to help him build a future together, even if it meant facing the ghosts he still carried. The sky over New York was overcast that morning, mirroring the somber mood hanging over Hayes Capital. Oliver had arrived at the office early, before sunrise, his face tense, showing the immense pressure he was under. Amelia, who had started to suspect something was wrong, received a message from him, asking if they could talk after hours. Throughout the day, the news spread like wildfire. Hayes Capital was going through one of its worst financial crises since its founding. Several high-risk investments, which had promised significant returns, had failed, leaving Oliver facing decisions that could impact the future of many employees and small businesses that depended on Hayes Capital's support. Amelia watched it all unfold with apprehension. She knew Oliver was a careful leader who rarely made decisions without analyzing every possibility. But she also knew that the business world didn't always allow for easy or ethical choices. The pressure was clearly taking the toll on him, and for the first time, Amelia began to wonder how far he would go to protect his company. In the late afternoon, Amelia went to Oliver's office, where she found him buried under piles of documents and spreadsheets. His eyes were red, his face reflecting an exhaustion she had never seen before. "Oliver," she began hesitantly, entering the room and closing the door behind her. "Are you okay?" He looked up, and for a brief moment, she saw the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "I won't lie, Amelia. The situation is worse than we expected. Some of the investments we made were riskier than the financial team anticipated. And with the market instability, we're facing serious losses." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. "And I don't have much time to fix this." She stepped closer, touching his hand in a gesture of silent support. "Oliver, I'm here to help, but I need to understand what's really going on, and what decisions you plan to make." He looked away, and Amelia sensed there was something he was hesitant to share. Oliver had always been private about his corporate decision-making, but now, in the face of a crisis, she knew transparency between them was essential. "We're considering cutting investments in some startups under our wing," he said, his voice serious. "These companies rely on us to grow, but now they're becoming a financial burden we can no longer sustain. It's a difficult choice, but it might be the only way to save the company." Amelia's heart sank. Many of these startups, young and innovative, counted on Hayes Capital not just as an investor, but as a partner that believed in their growth potential. The impact of such a decision could be devastating for many people. "Oliver, you know how much these companies rely on you. Some were built on the promise of that support. If you cut those investments, it could mean the end for them." Oliver remained silent for a long moment, his face dark. She knew he was aware of the consequences, but she also knew the company was his priority. "I understand, Amelia," he replied, his tone cold and calculating, the way he often sounded when discussing business. "But if we don't take action," Hayes Capital might not survive. I need to be rational, to think about all the employees and partners who depend on us. I believe this is the only way out." She tried to find a way to balance her support for him with the values she had always stood for as a journalist. If she were to report on what was happening, Amelia knew she would have to confront her own professional and personal ethics, especially now that she was involved with Oliver. As a journalist, her duty was to report the facts, but as someone who cared for him, the decision was incredibly painful. "I need to think about this, Oliver," she said finally, her voice low. "It's not an easy choice for me either." He looked at her, and for a moment, Amelia saw a flash of understanding in his eyes. It seemed he finally understood her dilemma and the difficulty of balancing her professional responsibilities with her personal commitment. "I understand this puts you in a difficult position," he replied, his tone serious but gentle. "I don't want you to compromise your principles for me, Amelia. I just hope that you understand what I have to do." Amelia nodded, but her doubts continued to grow. She knew Oliver would do whatever it took to save the company, but at the same time, she feared the impact of this decision on everything he had built. If the rumors spread, they could cause irreparable damage to his reputation. In the following days, Hayes Capital's financial crisis deepened, and the tension in the office intensified. Oliver began holding closed-door meetings, discussing strategies to minimize the damage. But rumors of cuts and investment withdrawals circulated, and suspicion among the team members grew. In this tense atmosphere, a bombshell hit the market. A rival company, led by a former colleague of Oliver's, released information that put Hayes Capital in an even more precarious position. The article accused Oliver of maintaining investments with no financial viability and suggested that he was protecting certain companies over others to serve personal interests. It was a serious accusation, and it made clear that someone was determined to take him down at any cost. Amelia was shocked when she read the news. She knew something was wrong. The information released was internal, and someone with privileged access to Hayes Capital's financial reports was clearly using it against Oliver. She felt a mix of indignation and helplessness, but she knew she had to act. She went to Oliver's office, finding him in a state of contained anger. He held the printed article in one hand, gripping the paper so tightly it looked like he was about to tear it apart. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low and tense. "Someone inside is leaking information, and they're twisting everything to bring me down." Amelia watched him, her heart heavy at seeing him in such despair. It was hard to imagine that behind his controlled facade, Oliver could be so vulnerable. He had always presented himself as an invincible leader, but now she saw a man fighting not only to protect his company, but also to preserve his dignity and reputation. "Oliver, who could do this? Who would have a reason to harm you like this?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. He let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "An old colleague, Maxwell Price. We had conflicts in the past, and he's always seen me as a threat. He owns a rival company and would do anything to see me fall." Amelia felt the weight of what was happening. Maxwell, it seemed, was using insider information to sabotage Oliver. And the worst part was that Oliver now had to decide whether to make unpopular decisions to survive or to confront Maxwell directly, risking even greater damage. Amelia knew she had an ethical decision to make as a journalist. If she reported what she knew about Oliver's ethical dilemmas, she could lose his trust and possibly destroy what they had built together. But if she remained silent, she would be going against everything she believed in as a professional. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. With every thought, Oliver's words echoed in her mind, along with the visible pain he showed when talking about Maxwell's betrayal. She knew that Oliver had let his guard down with her in a way he never had with anyone else. But at the same time, she knew she had to stay true to her values as a journalist. The next day, she decided to confront him. She knew she needed to be honest with him about her intentions, and more than that, she needed to understand how far he was willing to go to protect the company. When she entered his office, Oliver watched her in silence, as if he already knew what she was about to say. "Oliver, I need to be honest with you," she began, her tone firm but hesitant. "This situation with Maxwell and the decisions you're making, I don't know if I can just ignore all of this. It's my job to report the truth, and I'm torn between that and what I feel for you." He watched her silently, and Amelia saw the pain in his gaze. He knew how much this situation affected her, but at the same time, it was clear he needed her by his side now more than ever. "Amelia, I never wanted to put you in such a difficult position," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "And I won't ask you to stand by me if it means compromising who you are. But know that what I'm doing is to protect everything I've built. And yes, maybe I have to make choices that go against what I'd prefer." She felt the weight of his words, and a pang in her chest told her how painful it would be to move forward with the article. But she knew she couldn't ignore her principles. She needed to find a way to stay true to herself, and at the same time, protect the integrity of the man she loved. "I need some time to think," she murmured, feeling tears welling up. "This isn't easy for me, Oliver. I love you, but I can't ignore everything that's happening." He watched her in silence, but his gaze spoke more than words ever could. Amelia felt a heaviness in her heart as she left his office, unsure of what the future held for them, but certain that, from now on, nothing would ever be the same between them. The days that followed were the hardest in Amelia's life. Since her confrontation with Oliver, she felt torn between loyalty to the man she loved and commitment to the truth that had always guided her career. The crisis at Hayes Capital had escalated, and Maxwell's threat loomed over them like a shadow, putting Oliver in an increasingly complex and precarious position. She knew that Oliver was making hard decisions, some of which would irreversibly affect the lives of many people. The pressure was immense, but what worried her most was the realization that he seemed ready to sacrifice fundamental principles to keep the company afloat. With every conversation Amelia had with her journalist colleagues and editors, the tension grew. They wanted an explosive story, an investigation revealing the behind-the-scenes workings of high-risk investment firms and how many of them, including Hayes Capital, sacrificed ethics for profit. And she knew that Oliver's recent decisions only fueled this negative perception. One night, as she reflected on everything, she decided to seek advice from someone she trusted deeply, her editor-in-chief, Martin. Martin had always guided her wisely throughout her career and knew how much she valued the truth. But he also sensed there was something personal at play, something beyond professionalism. When she arrived at the newsroom and stepped into Martin's office, he greeted her with an understanding yet keen look. He knew Amelia was conflicted and would need more than just simple advice to make a decision. "Amelia, I can tell this is more than just a story for you," he said bluntly, watching her closely. "But we need to think about the impact of what's happening at Hayes Capital. This situation could have huge consequences for the financial market and our readers." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I know, Martin, and you're right, but it's complicated. Oliver is under immense pressure, and he's important to me. Very important," she admitted, her voice low and trembling. "But I don't know if I can write this story without betraying him." Martin sighed, but kept his gaze steady. "Journalism is a hard profession, Amelia. It always will be. But you have to ask yourself, what matters most to you? Your integrity or your relationship with him? I know it's not easy, but if you decide to write this story, it has to be truthful, impartial, and above all, honest." Martin's words struck deep. She knew that, as a journalist, her duty was to the truth, and that a story like this could warn many people, especially those who trusted investment firms like Hayes Capital. At the same time, she felt as if she were about to betray Oliver's trust, something that could end their relationship for good. In the following days, Amelia threw herself into her research, reviewing every document she had gathered on Hayes Capital's situation. She hesitated, stopped, and restarted countless times, trying to find a way to write the article without harming Oliver. But as she went through the process, she realized it would be impossible. Oliver had made decisions that went against everything she stood for as a journalist and as a person. He was sacrificing ethics to keep the company alive, and in doing so, he was compromising values she believed were non-negotiable. In the silence of early morning, alone in her apartment, Amelia finally made her decision. Sitting at her computer, She took a deep breath, feeling tears threaten to fall as she typed the first words of her article. She knew that by publishing it, she was risking everything she had built with Oliver. She knew he would feel betrayed and might never be able to look at her the same way. But in that moment, the voice of truth spoke louder. She had to tell the story, even if it cost her the love of her life. The article was published at the start of the following week. Amelia wasn't in the newsroom when it came out, but she received numerous messages from colleagues and friends congratulating her on the courage and honesty of her work. The article quickly gained traction, shared across news sites and discussed on financial programs. It was a straightforward, hard-hitting story about how Hayes Capital was making controversial decisions to stay afloat, sacrificing small businesses and acting contrary to the transparency and ethics it had always preached. The impact was immediate. Oliver, who hadn't yet read the article, received a flood of messages and calls from investors, colleagues, and even his own team. When he finally sat down to read the article, a mixture of shock, anger, and despair washed over him. By the time he finished, his fists were clenched, his face rigid. He felt betrayed in a way he had never thought possible. Amelia, the woman he had begun to trust like no one before, had exposed his decisions, his choices, and worst of all, his vulnerability to the world. Hours later, Amelia received a message from Oliver asking to meet. The tone was formal and distant, devoid of the warmth or closeness they once shared. She knew this conversation would be final, and her heart raced as she made her way to the meeting place, a discreet cafe in the city center. When she arrived, she saw Oliver seated in a corner, his shoulders tense, his face expressionless. He looked at her with a gaze that was both cold and sad, as if the woman he loved had become a stranger. "Oliver," she began, but he raised his hand, signaling her to stop. "No," he said, his voice low but filled with a contained pain. "Let me speak first." Amelia swallowed hard, nodding. "I trusted you, Amelia. I let my guard down, and I believed I was safe with you," he murmured, his eyes fixed on hers. "But you took everything I shared with you, everything I revealed, and used it against me." She felt her chest tighten, his words echoing in her mind like a harsh judgment. "Oliver, I never wanted to hurt you, but the situation at Hayes Capital was affecting so many people's lives. I couldn't turn a blind eye to it. My duty is to the truth, and I couldn't ignore what was happening." He watched her in silence, but the gaze she knew so well now looked distant and filled with hurt. "So you chose journalism. You chose the truth above all else, didn't you?" he said, his voice bitter. "And I understand in a way, but I can't just forgive you for exposing me. You left me vulnerable to the world, Amelia, and I don't know if I can get past that." Tears began to well in her eyes, the pain intensifying with each of his words. "Oliver, I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it because I believed people had the right to know. I love you, but I can't betray who I am, what I stand for. Please try to understand." He looked away, clenching his fists on the table. They sat in silence, a silence that seemed to scream the distance that had formed between them. "I understand, Amelia," he finally replied, his voice dark, "but what you did broke something in me, and I don't know if I can look at you without remembering this, without feeling that you abandoned me when I needed you most." She wanted to argue, wanted to say that she was there for him, but she knew any words would sound empty. Oliver didn't want apologies, and his pain was too deep to be healed by any explanation. "I think we need to take some time, Amelia," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "I need space, and so do you. Maybe it's best if we each go our own way." She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, her heart on the verge of shattering into pieces. But she knew there was nothing more to say. Oliver was resolute, and what she feared most had come true. Her commitment to the truth had cost her the love of her life. "I understand," she whispered, holding back tears. "If that's your decision, I respect it." He nodded but didn't look at her again. He simply stood up, took his jacket, and left the cafe, leaving her alone, heartbroken, with the knowledge that she had just lost something precious. As she watched Oliver's silhouette disappear through the door, Amelia felt empty. Everything they had built, everything they had shared now seemed lost, consumed by a difficult, inevitable choice. She sat there in silence, the pain dominating every thought, every sensation. She knew she had made the right decision as a journalist, but as a woman, she felt she had just lost the person she loved most in the world. Alone, Amelia finally allowed herself to cry. The first day after the breakup was a blur for Amelia. She had spent the night awake, trying to process the painful conversation with Oliver at the cafe. But the feelings of guilt and loss weighed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Morning brought a hollow emptiness that filled every corner of her apartment, as if the world had lost some of its color. She tried to focus on her work, but the routine that once offered comfort now felt empty. Each keystroke seemed heavy, each email a distraction that failed to fill the void he had left behind. Oliver, on the other hand, had thrown himself even more intensely into his work. His office, once a sanctuary for tackling the challenges at Hayes Capital, now became a refuge from his own emotions. He arrived earlier, left later, and barely interacted with his colleagues, limiting himself to giving orders and discussing strategies. Outwardly, he maintained his usual composure, but inside, he felt Amelia's absence with an intensity he couldn't quite understand. As days passed, both began reflecting on the impact they had had on each other's lives. Amelia, in her moments of silence, remembered how Oliver had made her feel alive. With him, she had discovered a depth of emotions she had never experienced before. A connection so strong it seemed to defy even the toughest decisions. She realized that her life, built on commitment to truth and independence, had found unexpected meaning beside him. Despite the pain of their separation, she felt that somehow he was still part of her, a living memory in every thought and every quiet space. Oliver, in turn, struggled to understand the emptiness Amelia's absence had left in his life. She had been the first person to see beyond his cold, controlled exterior, the first to face his wounds and fears without pulling back. With her, he had discovered a kind of intimacy he had never thought possible, a connection that, despite the circumstances, made him want to be a better person. Amelia had entered his life like a storm, challenging his certainties and questioning his choices. But now that she was gone, he realized that her presence had changed him in an irreversible way. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in his office, Oliver found a small note Amelia had written in the margin of an old document. It was a brief, almost insignificant note, but seeing her handwriting made his chest tighten. He remembered how she had looked at every detail, how her enthusiasm for the work was contagious, how she had inspired him to view the world with more sensitivity and empathy. The emptiness he felt seemed to deepen with each memory of her, and no matter how much he tried to move on, Amelia's absence was a wound he knew would not heal easily. Amelia, meanwhile, sought comfort in the small memories she held of Oliver. She relived the intimate conversations they had shared, the moments of companionship, and even the silences that now felt like a painful absence. She remembered how he had supported her in moments of uncertainty, and how his quiet strength had made her feel safe. It was as if he had become a part of her, and the thought that he was no longer there, that they would never share confidences and glances again, was almost unbearable. Close friends began noticing the change in Amelia's demeanor. Her editor-in-chief, Martin, was the first to pick up on the sadness in her eyes. He knew the impact the article had had on her and the pain it had caused, but he also knew she had made the right choice as a journalist. One morning, when she arrived at the office early, trying to escape her own thoughts, Martin approached her with words of support. "Amelia, you know you did what you had to do. It wasn't easy, but you made the right choice," he said with understanding. "Truth comes at a cost, and sometimes it's high. But remember why you started doing this in the first place." Amelia nodded, but Martin's words, though true, couldn't ease the longing she felt. She knew the decision had been necessary, but the emptiness left by Oliver was a wound that continued to ache. She tried to fill her time with more tasks and projects, but at the end of each day, his absence weighed heavier than anything else. Oliver continued to avoid personal contact. In an attempt to focus solely on work, he limited his interactions to brief, straightforward meetings, ignoring any attempts by colleagues to get close. His distant and cold attitude began to affect the office environment, with employees whispering about his change in behavior. The driven, motivated Oliver, who had once inspired everyone, seemed to have been replaced by a bitter and introspective version of himself. Someone burdened by a deep wound. One night, Oliver finally allowed himself to pause and reflect. Sitting alone in his office, surrounded by silence, he closed his eyes and let memories of Amelia flood his mind. He remembered their first encounter, how she had challenged him with an audacity few dared, and how, over time, she had become a constant presence in his life, someone he could trust. He missed her smile, the way she seemed to understand his dilemmas, and the tenderness she brought out in him. It was as if, with her, he had found a home, something he never thought he would need. Weeks passed, and both Amelia and Oliver felt each other's absence like a persistent shadow. Though each tried to move forward, the longing manifested in small things, in the music they listened to, the places they visited, and in the silent moments that had once been filled by the other's presence. It was as if, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape the connection they had shared. On Amelia's birthday, weeks after the breakup, she was surprised by a small gift left at her door. It was a rare edition of a book she had casually mentioned to Oliver months before, during a conversation she had nearly forgotten. As she unwrapped it, she found a small note inside that read simply, "Happy birthday. I still think of you." She read and reread those words, her heart racing and a wave of emotions overwhelming her. It was the first message he had sent since the separation, and though brief, it was filled with meaning. Oliver still thought of her, still held her in his thoughts, just as she held him in hers every day. As much as she wanted to respond, something held her back. Perhaps it was the fear that he was still hurt, that the wound she had inflicted hadn't yet healed. Or maybe it was pride, an invisible barrier keeping them apart despite the obvious longing. Oliver spent Amelia's birthday night with a mixture of regret and nostalgia. He wished he could be with her, wished he could see her smile, but he knew that her choice to publish the article had created a chasm between them, a choice he still couldn't fully forgive, yet couldn't forget either. The next morning, as Amelia held the book, still unsure of how to respond, she received an unexpected call. It was an old colleague of Oliver's, someone who knew their history and was aware of the crisis they had faced. He mentioned, casually, that Oliver wasn't handling the pressure well, and that his behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. Amelia felt her heart clench at this news. Her concern for him outweighed any resentment she might have held. As the days passed, the longing only grew stronger, and both began to feel that perhaps there was still something left to say. One last conversation that might allow them to address the unfinished feelings between them. Amelia knew that if she wanted to rebuild Oliver's trust, she would have to be honest about her feelings and intentions, showing him that her choice to tell the truth didn't mean she loved him any less. Oliver, meanwhile, reflected on what trust truly meant. He realized that despite the pain he felt, he couldn't forget Amelia, and her presence had changed the way he saw the world. Her decision, though painful, was a reflection of the values he admired and, in a way, inspired him. He couldn't deny that, even with everything that had happened, he still loved her deeply. The distance between them, though painful, began to serve as a time for reflection. Amelia and Oliver, both wounded, realized that maybe, despite the hurt and difficult choices, there was still something strong and real between them, something that deserved one last chance. Amelia was trying to move on. The weeks after the breakup had been a blur of longing, regret, and constant attempts to drown herself in work to avoid thinking about Oliver. Yet he continued to invade her thoughts, her dreams, and even the places she frequented. Everything seemed laced with memories of him, as if he were a permanent, invisible presence in her life. As much as she tried to ignore it, she knew that part of her was still deeply attached to him. One day, while having coffee at her desk, a news article caught her attention. It was a brief piece, nearly unnoticed among the others, but it immediately set her on alert. Hayes Capital faces another potential stock drop amid financial struggles. The information was vague, but she knew that any drop in the company's stock could signify a much deeper crisis. With her experience in finance, Amelia could read between the lines. Oliver's company was in trouble, and he was likely under immense pressure to find a quick solution. Throughout the afternoon, Amelia dug deeper into the situation. She made calls, consulted sources, and gathered every piece of information she could. With each new detail, her concern grew. The situation was serious. Several smaller companies Hayes Capital had invested in were struggling, resulting in a general decline in the firm's profits. This not only put the company at risk of a damaged reputation, but also left Oliver vulnerable to his investors, as he might be forced to sell shares or even relinquish part of his control to stabilize it. Knowing both the personal and professional toll that such a loss would take on him, Amelia felt overwhelmed by a mix of anxiety and restlessness. She knew Oliver wasn't the type to ask for help, let alone from her, but she couldn't ignore what was happening. No matter what had happened between them, the love and concern she felt for him were still strong. After a sleepless night, she made up her mind. She would go to see Oliver. She needed to offer her support, even if he might react with distrust or coldness. Amelia knew he probably still harbored hurt from her article, but the situation was bigger than that. The following morning, she entered the Hayes Capital building with a nervousness she hadn't felt since her first visit there. Memories of their silent understanding, their deep conversations, and the unspoken glances came rushing back. When she reached the reception, she noticed the tense atmosphere and saw worried expressions on people's faces. Employees spoke in hushed tones, and a few suspicious glances fell on her, as if they knew about her history with Oliver. Before she could question herself, Oliver's secretary saw her and approached. "Miss Carter, Mr. Hayes is in a meeting right now, but I can let him know you're here." Amelia nodded, feeling her heart race. She had no idea how he would react to seeing her there, but there was no turning back now. She waited for a few minutes in the lobby, trying to calm her mind and prepare herself for the reunion. Finally, the office door opened, and she saw him. Oliver looked serious and exhausted, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His expression hardened briefly when he saw her, but then he nodded, motioning for her to enter. Closing the door behind her, the silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words, memories, hurts, and feelings both were trying to ignore. "Amelia," he began, his voice controlled but lacking the warmth she remembered. "What brings you here?" She hesitated, but forced herself to meet his gaze. This wouldn't be an easy conversation. "I heard about the situation at Hayes Capital, and I'm worried about you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't ignore it, Oliver. I know we're apart, but I'm here to offer help. If you need it, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Oliver looked at her in silence, and she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. But then he looked away, crossing his arms and assuming the reserved stance she knew so well. "The situation is complicated, yes," he admitted with a sigh. "But I'm not sure there's much you can do, Amelia. We're dealing with impatient investors, a drop in stock value, and the possibility of losing major partners. Every decision I make carries risk, and we're at the limit." His voice was heavy, each word laced with an invisible pain. Amelia stepped forward, feeling the need to bridge the distance he was still trying to maintain. "Oliver, I know how much this means to you, and I know how proud you are, but accepting help could make a difference right now, even if that help comes from me," she added with a faint smile. "I know the article I wrote hurt you, and I regret how it impacted our relationship, but please, let me help you now." Oliver looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. He seemed torn between wanting her support and fearing to trust her again. "That article," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you know how much that destroyed me? I thought we could be something more, Amelia. I thought I could trust you. And then, you exposed everything, left me vulnerable." His words cut deep, but Amelia kept her gaze steady on him. "I know, Oliver. I know I hurt you, and believe me, not a day goes by that I don't think about it. But please understand, I never intended to destroy you. I was trying to do what I believed was right, as a journalist and as a person. But in the process, I ended up hurting you." A long silence fell between them, and Oliver seemed to wrestle with himself. He stepped closer to her, and the intensity in his gaze made her hold her breath. It was a look filled with pain, longing, and something still alive between them. Something that neither time nor hurt had managed to erase. "I can't deny how much you mean to me, Amelia," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know if I can forget everything that happened. It still hurts. A lot." She nodded, feeling tears threaten but holding them back. "I miss you too, Oliver. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but I'm willing to stand by you however you'll let me." They stood in silence, each absorbing the weight of the other's words. It was a moment of mutual understanding, where both realized that, despite the hurts, the connection they shared was stronger than pride or pain. After a moment, Oliver sighed, letting his shoulders relax as though he was finally allowing some of his rigidity to fall away. "I appreciate your willingness," he said, his tone softer. "Maybe I need you more than I'm ready to admit." Amelia felt a wave of relief, a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She stepped closer, resting her hand on his arm in a gesture of support. Oliver looked down at her hand and, after a second, placed his own over it, as a sign that he was ready to try, little by little, to rebuild the trust they had lost. In the weeks that followed, Amelia and Oliver began working together again, focusing on Hayes Capital's crisis. Their collaboration rekindled the old camaraderie between them, but it also exposed feelings that had lain dormant. Each glance, each moment they spent working side by side was charged with a silent tension, a constant reminder of all they had been and could be. With her talent for financial analysis and strategy, Amelia helped Oliver explore alternative options to manage investors and rebuild the confidence of partners. Oliver, in turn, started to open up more, consulting her on important decisions and sharing aspects of the business he once kept to himself. This partnership wasn't just about stabilizing the company, but also about rebuilding the foundation of trust that had been broken. As time went on, the barrier between them began to dissolve, and Oliver gradually allowed Amelia to see a more vulnerable side of him. He talked about his uncertainties and the fears he had always hidden behind his facade as a firm, calculating CEO. Listening to him, Amelia felt grateful that he was opening up, allowing her to see the real man behind the armor. One evening, as they wrapped up a meeting alone in the office, Oliver looked at her for a moment, as if gathering the courage to say something important. Amelia noticed his gaze and felt her heart quicken, anticipation building within her. "Amelia," he began, his voice soft and hesitant. I don't think I ever stopped feeling what I felt for you. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget." His words felt like a confession she had been waiting to hear for so long. Smiling, she reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I couldn't forget either, Oliver. You've always been here, even when you tried to push me away." He pulled her close, and the kiss they shared was like the reunion of two souls who had been lost and had finally found each other again. It was a kiss filled with longing, promises, and a renewed hope. In that moment, they knew that, despite everything, they were ready to face whatever came their way together. From that point on, they both knew that, although the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready to try again, confident that the love they shared was strong enough to overcome the hurts of the past. The crisis at Hayes Capital continued to grow, despite Oliver and Amelia's tireless efforts to stabilize the company. Meetings with investors were tense, and every decision had to be meticulously calculated. Although they had made some progress, the reality was still hard to face. The only viable way to save the company required a sacrifice Oliver had never imagined he'd have to make. On an especially cold morning, Oliver called his executive team together to discuss the latest proposal from a group of investors. The plan required Oliver to relinquish part of the company's controlling shares, transferring power to a board mostly composed of external representatives. In exchange, the investors would inject the necessary capital to keep Hayes Capital afloat. Throughout the meeting, he remained silent, listening intently to the discussions and arguments for and against the proposal. Several team members believed this was the best decision, however difficult. Others, those closest to Oliver, looked disappointed, knowing what giving up control would mean. When the meeting ended, Oliver stayed behind in the room, lost in thought. He felt torn between the responsibility of saving the company his father had built and the painful reality that, to do so, he'd have to give up his power. The office, which had always been a symbol of his success and the independence he valued, now felt like a place of sacrifice where he would need to make a decision that would change everything. Amelia, who had listened to the meeting from her nearby office, waited, feeling a growing restlessness. She knew Oliver was facing an impossible choice, a decision that went against everything he had always believed in. But she also knew that behind the firm facade, he was emotionally drained. He was on the verge of losing what he valued most, and with it, an essential part of himself. When Oliver finally emerged from the boardroom, Amelia met him in the hallway. He stopped when he saw her, and she could see the exhaustion on his face, an expression that was a mixture of weariness and sorrow. He didn't need to say anything. The look they shared was enough for Amelia to understand the weight of the decision he was about to make. "Can we talk?" she asked gently. He nodded, and they went to his office together. Amelia closed the door behind them and sat across from him, who stayed silent for a few moments, as if searching for the right words. "You heard what we discussed in the meeting," he began, his voice low. "They want controlling shares in Hayes Capital. They don't just want to invest. They want decision-making power. If I accept, it means giving up the leadership, means letting go of everything my father built." Amelia felt the pain in his voice and fully understood what that meant. She knew Oliver had always valued independence, that the company was more than a responsibility to him. It was part of his identity, a legacy he had always believed he was meant to protect. Yet, she also knew that sometimes the hardest choices required sacrifice. "Oliver, I know how much this means to you," she said, her voice soft and encouraging. "But sometimes, holding on to something we love also means being willing to give up part of it so that it can survive. It may be the hardest decision, but it could also be the most courageous one." He looked at her, his eyes showing a vulnerability he rarely revealed. She was the only person he allowed to see his weaknesses, and at that moment, he felt torn between his pride and the desire to do what was right. He took a deep breath, as if finding strength in her words. "I thought I was enough to carry this legacy," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But maybe I was a fool to believe I could keep everything under my control." Amelia smiled gently, reaching out and touching his hand in a gesture of warmth. "You are enough, Oliver. It's not the lack of control that defines your worth. If you make this decision, it will be out of love for the company and for the vision you and your father shared. And there's no weakness in recognizing when it's time to share the weight of that responsibility." Oliver held her hand, feeling the warmth and support he so needed in that moment. Amelia was the anchor that kept him steady amidst the storm. And as he looked into her eyes, he felt something that had long been dormant within him, a desire to live for something beyond the weight of his responsibilities. "Amelia," he murmured, leaning closer. "For so long, I thought I could face the world alone. But ever since you came into my life, I realize how wrong I was. You've brought something I didn't know I needed, something real." Amelia felt her heart race. His voice, so sincere and filled with emotion, made her realize that Oliver's sacrifice went beyond the company. He was ready to give up his pride and part of who he'd always been for what he felt for her. The light in his eyes was a mixture of longing and a promise of renewal. "Oliver, I want to be by your side too, but I don't want you to make this decision for me," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Do it because it's best for you, for the company, and for your father's legacy. And if you decide to go forward, I'll be here for you." He looked at her with admiration and deep love. It was clear that this decision was about more than business. It was a life choice, a shift in how he saw the world. He was ready to let go of part of his identity, the control he had always valued, to build something new and genuine with her. That night, Oliver reflected deeply. He walked through the empty office, observing every detail, every corner, as if he were saying goodbye to something that had defined him for years. He thought about his father, about everything he had built, and the pressure he had always felt to keep the legacy intact. He realized that, despite his pride in the company, he needed to let it evolve, even if it meant relinquishing part of his control. The next day, in a decisive meeting with the investors, Oliver made his decision. In a firm but respectful tone, he communicated his acceptance of the terms and explained his vision for the company. He emphasized that while he was relinquishing part of the control, he believed it was the right path to ensure the continuity and success of Hayes Capital. Leaving the meeting, he felt relieved but also a bit empty. It was as if a part of him had been left behind, yet he felt lighter, freer to move forward. At the end of the day, When he met Amelia in his office, she welcomed him with a smile, knowing he had made the hardest decision of his life. "So you finally decided to move forward?" she asked, pride and affection evident in her voice. Oliver smiled, approaching her and holding her hands. "I decided to move forward, Amelia. I decided to let go of control and, more importantly, to let go of the fear of losing you because of choices or pride. I want something real with you, something beyond all this." Amelia smiled, deeply moved, and wrapped him in a tight embrace. She felt his heartbeat against hers, and in that moment, she knew that everything they had gone through had made them stronger. He was there, finally free to be vulnerable, to love without reservations, and she knew she was willing to face any challenge by his side. As she looked into Oliver's eyes, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. His sacrifice had not only saved the company, but it had also paved the way for a future together, a future built on trust, love, and above all, the willingness to sacrifice pride to experience something real. "We're in this together, Oliver," she murmured, holding his face and sealing the promise with a gentle, meaningful kiss. The road ahead would be challenging, but together, they knew they could face anything. After Oliver's sacrifice of relinquishing part of his control over Hayes Capital, he and Amelia realized they were on the brink of a fresh start, not only for the company, but also for the relationship they had committed to rebuilding. The weight of saving the company was no longer Oliver's solitary battle. He was finally allowing Amelia to help him, and it brought him an unexpected sense of relief. Together, they formed a solid, complementary partnership, each bringing strengths and values that, when combined, created a powerful force. That morning, Amelia arrived at Oliver's office earlier than usual. She held an extra coffee for him and walked in unannounced, finding him already immersed in spreadsheets and reports, studying them closely. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she greeted him with a soft smile, offering him the coffee. "Brought a little something to help us get through whatever today has in store." Oliver looked up and smiled when he saw her. Her presence was like a fresh breeze, lifting the tension he had felt since deciding to share the company's ownership. Her small yet thoughtful gesture warmed his heart and reminded him just how much she meant to him. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he replied, accepting the coffee and gently touching her hand. "Help is always welcome, especially when it's from you." Amelia settled into the chair across from him, watching as he finished reviewing a few documents. He seemed calmer since the last investor meeting, but the company still faced challenges before it could fully stabilize. Adapting to shared leadership would require changes both in Hayes Capital's culture and in decision-making processes. Yet for the first time, Oliver didn't see this as a loss of control. He was starting to see it as growth. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, her tone gentle but direct. Oliver paused, reflecting for a moment before he answered, his eyes fixed on her, revealing a vulnerability he now allowed himself to show. "To be honest, it feels strange, but also freeing," he admitted. "For years, I carried this company as if I was solely responsible for its fate, the only one who could keep it steady. But now, with the control shared, I realize I can focus more on strategy, on details I used to overlook. And of course, I can count on you, which makes everything much more bearable." Amelia smiled, feeling a warm glow at his words. He was letting her see the human side behind the meticulous businessman, and the trust he placed in her was a precious gift. "And I'm here, Oliver, completely," she said, touching his hand again, "not just to help save the company, but to stand by your side in everything, in any situation. I believe in you, in your vision, and in what you mean to Hayes Capital." He held her hand and nodded, his gaze brimming with gratitude and affection. After a moment, he seemed to make a decision and pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. "Amelia, I have something to show you," he said, handing her the envelope. She took it curiously and opened it, finding a detailed document for a new investment project. The title immediately caught her attention: Social and Sustainable Investment Fund -SSIF. "Oliver, what is this?" she asked, looking at him with surprise. "It's an initiative I've been thinking about for a while," he explained. "Since we faced the financial crisis, I realized we need a more sustainable approach. This fund is designed to support startups and small businesses with social causes, like environmental development and social inclusion. It's ambitious, but I believe it could be a major step for Hayes Capital and the legacy I want to build. Amelia felt a wave of admiration wash over her. Seeing Oliver take such a committed stance on social responsibility moved her, and she knew this was a deep, genuine decision. "This is incredible, Oliver." She smiled, feeling even closer to him. "You have no idea how much this means to me, and I'm sure it will make a huge difference for everyone involved." He smiled back, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. There was a connection between them that went beyond work. It was something that united their aspirations, values, and feelings. The desire to build something together was palpable, and they both felt ready for a new commitment, one that transcended the boundaries of work. Over the following weeks, they devoted themselves wholeheartedly to planning the social investment fund, setting goals, and finding potential partners who shared the same vision. With each meeting and decision, Oliver felt increasingly empowered with Amelia by his side. She helped him look beyond numbers and traditional metrics, challenging him to create a project that was not only financially sound, but also morally inspiring. One evening, after a long day of meetings and presentations, Oliver and Amelia were alone in the office, reviewing the latest proposals. She was engrossed in a report, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. Watching her examine each detail with dedication and commitment, he realized he had found something invaluable, a partner in life and work. He moved closer, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, there's something I need to say to you," he said, his voice low but full of emotion. She looked up, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. "What is it?" Oliver took a deep breath, gathering the courage to put his feelings into words. "Working alongside you has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. But it's more than that. I realized that I want so much more with you. I want to build something solid, something that goes beyond work and any crisis. I want us to be partners, to face everything together, no matter what happens." Amelia's heart raced at his words. She knew that for him, opening up like this was an act of courage and love. She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Oliver, I feel the same. Being by your side makes me feel complete, and I can't imagine my life without you. I want all that, and so much more," she murmured with a tearful smile. He pulled her into a close embrace, and there, in the silent night, they solidified the commitment they felt. It wasn't just a relationship. It was a mutual promise of support, understanding, and partnership. It was the decision to live together, facing challenges and celebrating victories. The next day, the official announcement of Hayes Capital's new social investment fund was met with enthusiasm from the press and investors alike. The news marked the beginning of a new era for the company, now seen as an institution committed to social impact and sustainable development. Oliver and Amelia stood side by side throughout the press conference, and it was clear to everyone that they were a formidable pair, both as leaders and as a couple. As the fund began to take shape, they continued working together, closer than ever. Amid all the challenges, their love and commitment to each other grew stronger, and both knew they had found something rare and precious. Amelia, who had always prioritized her career and principles, now saw that those values could be fulfilled alongside Oliver, without one compromising the other. A month after the fund's launch, during a dinner celebrating the project's early successes, Oliver held Amelia's hand and paused. "I never imagined I could share all this with someone," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "But you've made everything better, Amelia. More than that, you make me want to be a better person." Amelia smiled, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "And you've shown me that love and commitment can be real when two people believe in the same ideals and vision. Thank you, Oliver, for trusting me, for letting me be part of this." He held her face and kissed her a kiss that sealed not only their relationship, but also the future they were both ready to build together. In that moment, they knew that the commitment they shared went beyond any document, contract, or title. It was a bond of trust, love, and respect that would guide them for the rest of their lives. Together, they would face any challenges that came their way, knowing that side by side, they could change not only their own lives, but also the world around them. Gradually, the storm that had swept through Hayes Capital finally began to clear. With the social investment fund fully implemented, the company was gaining a new reputation in the market. standing out as a leader in corporate responsibility and sustainable innovation. Oliver's decision to relinquish part of his control, something he had never thought he'd be capable of, was proving to be the most crucial step of his career, and unexpectedly, also the most liberating. For Amelia, witnessing Oliver's transformation, as well as that of the company, was both a personal and professional triumph. Seeing him make decisions based not only on profit, but also on values made her feel even more connected to him. The love they shared wasn't just a romance. It was a commitment to a shared vision of the world they wanted to build together. On that sunny morning, the office was filled with a light, optimistic energy. Many employees who had once feared for the company's future now wore broad smiles. Content with the new direction Hayes Capital was taking, Oliver and Amelia were seen as a guiding force, an inspiring couple who combined responsibility and boldness, showing that success was possible even amid difficulties. At the end of the workday, Amelia and Oliver decided to celebrate the success of a recent partnership with a foundation focused on social inclusion. Walking hand in hand to a restaurant they both loved, they shared smiles and knowing glances, toasting to their achievements. "To challenges and love," Amelia said, raising her glass. "To challenges, to love, and to the future we're building," Oliver added, his eyes sparkling with happiness. After a few toasts and laughter, Oliver took her hand, his face now adopting a serious yet affectionate expression. "Amelia, there's something I've been reflecting on for some time. With everything we've been through and the company finally stable, I realize it's time for another kind of decision," he said, leaning closer to her. "I want to change the direction of my professional life. I want to dedicate myself to something more meaningful, something that goes beyond Hayes Capital's legacy." Amelia looked at him, surprised but with an encouraging smile. "What do you have in mind?" Oliver paused, savoring the thought before he spoke. "I want to expand the social investment fund. I want to turn it into something larger. A project that can impact not only startups, but also communities in need. I want to help young entrepreneurs, to offer opportunities to those who haven't had the same chances I've had. I believe I can do more than just preserve my family's name. I can leave it with a lasting purpose." Amelia felt her heart swell with admiration. Seeing Oliver, once a closed and prideful man, now motivated to use his experience to make a difference, made her even more certain of her love for him. "That's incredible, Oliver. And I know you'll have a huge impact. You have my full trust and my support, now and always," she said, with the smile he loved so much. He held her hand more firmly, and after a moment of silence, he continued, "And part of that future also involves you, Amelia. Being by your side, sharing this journey, has made me realize that the love we have is the greatest accomplishment of all. I want this next chapter to be ours, truly. I don't just want your support, I want you as my partner in every way." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. His words touched her deeply, as though everything they had been through was finally gaining a greater meaning. "Oliver, She took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears of happiness. "I want this more than anything. You've shown me a side of myself I didn't know existed. With you, I feel I can be who I am, and at the same time, someone even better. There's nothing I want more than to build this life with you." He pulled her close, and they embraced, feeling the warmth and security of a love they had built and that was now unbreakable. After that night, they dedicated themselves to transforming the investment fund into an independent organization dedicated to fostering the development of underserved communities. Ideas flowed naturally between them, and each plan became a celebration of the partnership they had solidified, both as a couple and as professionals with a shared mission. Months later, the organization had taken on a life of its own. The first project was a training program for young entrepreneurs, offering mentorship, workshops, and financial support. Oliver, now more motivated than ever, found in his work a renewed sense of purpose. Amelia, always passionate about truth and justice, saw this new role as an opportunity to amplify her impact and contribute to the stories of people whose voices were often overlooked. One winter afternoon, as they reviewed proposals for the organization's upcoming launch event, Oliver pulled Amelia aside, away from their colleagues' attention. With the same intense, loving gaze as always, He held her hand and looked into her eyes. "I know I've already promised you the future, but there's something I want to do now," he said. Reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small box, Amelia's eyes widened, surprised and moved. And before she could say anything, Oliver opened the box, revealing a simple yet stunning ring that sparkled in the room's soft light. "Amelia Carter, my partner in life, in work, and in everything I want to build from here on. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my confidant, and my love forever?" She smiled, tears streaming down her face, and nodded with a joy that came from the depths of her heart. "Yes, Oliver, yes. I want to spend my life by your side. Nothing would make me happier." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced, sealing the promise of a love they had built with patience, forgiveness, and commitment. From that moment on, they knew they were ready to face any challenge, to support each other, and to walk together no matter what the future held. That day, as they left the office hand in hand, the world around them felt brighter, more full of possibilities. The chilly wind was nothing compared to the warmth they felt, and both knew that despite the challenges, they had found a true love that could weather any storm. And so, with the company in good hands, their organization flourishing, and a brilliant future ahead, Amelia and Oliver embarked on a new chapter of their lives, confident that together, they could turn their dreams into reality. 2 years had passed since Amelia and Oliver embarked on their journey with the Social Investment Fund, creating a new path for both Hayes Capital and their own lives. The organization had become a leader in social development and sustainable impact, supporting hundreds of projects focused on education, healthcare, and environmental protection in underserved communities. The team had grown, and the success was celebrated widely, but for them, the greatest triumph lay in the lives they had transformed and the knowledge that they had contributed to a brighter future. In that time, Amelia and Oliver found deep harmony in their routines, balancing work and love, always nurturing the partnership and support that had united them from the start. Each challenge they faced together brought them closer, and over the years, they learned that true success was found in the simplicity of the love they shared. One spring afternoon, they finally decided to do something they had planned for a long time: a small trip to Tuscany, Italy. It was a special place for both of them, a region that inspired feelings of peace, where they hoped to have time just for themselves, far from daily pressures. They stayed in a small village, surrounded by vineyards and green hills that looked like they had been painted. The scenery was enchanting, inviting contemplation, and they both knew that this place would become unforgettable. One evening, after a starlit dinner, Oliver and Amelia strolled hand in hand through the fields, enjoying the quiet and each other's company. The sky was clear, and the moon lit up the landscape around them, reflected in her eyes. He stopped and pulled her close. "You know, sometimes I still marvel at everything we went through to get here," he said, his tone affectionate. "But the truth is, I wouldn't change a thing. Every choice, every mistake, all of it brought us to this moment, and it's exactly where I want to be." Amelia looked at him, her heart warming with his words. His expression was one of pure sincerity, and she knew he was speaking of every experience they'd shared, of the struggles and sacrifices that now made them stronger than ever. "I feel the same, Oliver," she replied with a gentle smile. "What we've built goes beyond anything I could have dreamed of. You are my home, and every moment with you makes me want to relive it all. Every step, every new beginning." He smiled and wrapped her in an embrace, pulling her into a kiss that, even after so long, still had the power to take her breath away. In that instant, nothing else mattered, only them and the love that bound them. The next morning, as they strolled through the village, Oliver watched her eyes light up as she admired every detail of the place. With a laugh, he pulled her close, his eyes revealing a hint of excitement that Amelia didn't often see. "You know, Amelia," he began with a mysterious tone, "I've been thinking, and I think we can make this trip even more special." She looked at him curiously, but before she could ask, he pointed to a small house beside a vineyard, surrounded by fields of lavender and olive trees. "What if we had a place like this? Just for us, a place we could come whenever we needed peace, a home that would be our retreat, where we could create new memories and build our legacy. Amelia felt tears fill her eyes. The idea of having such a special place, one that reflected their love and where they could escape from the world, touched her heart deeply. "Oliver, that would be wonderful," she whispered, touching his face tenderly. "A home just for us, where we can be simply ourselves. I would love that." In the months that followed, they made that dream a reality. The little house became the retreat they had always wanted. They decorated every corner with love and care, filling it with memories and touches that symbolized the journey they had shared. The house became a place to celebrate anniversaries, milestones, and all the special moments of their lives, a place where they could set aside responsibilities and simply be Oliver and Amelia, two people who had found love amid difficulties and now lived it fully. Years later, in that same house, now with young children playing in the lavender fields and running among the olive trees, Oliver and Amelia reflected on the life they had built. Hayes Capital was thriving. The social organization had expanded its projects across different parts of the world, and the love they shared remained as strong as on the first day. One afternoon, while watching the sunset from the terrace, Amelia rested her head on Oliver's shoulder, and he wrapped her in a tight embrace, as if wanting to keep her close forever. "Remember what you told me at the beginning about challenges and love?" he asked with a loving smile. "I never imagined we would live so much, that we would create all of this together." She smiled, her eyes shining with the light of the sunset. "And it was all so much better than any dream, because it was real, built with love, sacrifice, and faith in who we were. And I wouldn't change a thing, Oliver. Absolutely nothing." He kissed her, and they sat in silence, watching the horizon that lay before them. They knew the future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it together, strengthened by the love and legacy they had created. The world around them was a celebration of everything they had achieved, not just professionally, but above all, in heart and soul. Amelia and Oliver's story was, above all, a tribute to resilience and the power of true love, a love that overcomes every obstacle, that finds strength in weaknesses, and that, even in the face of difficulties, continues to bloom.